All right. Good morning, everyone. I am recording this lecture. I apologize for not recording Wednesday's lecture. Over the weekend, I'm going to try to record the segment, the module on acid-base physiology. So I'll post that sometime this weekend, so you'll have it next week to study from. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to continue on with Intro to Respiratory System. And I should get through most of the intro and some of the breathing mechanics module, okay? Meghna actually, she passed out this respiratory physiology sheet. Don't forget that your essential renal calculations are due today. You can pass it back or set it on the table on your way out, and Meghna can pick that up. This sheet isn't due until next Friday. So I realized I'm still trying to get everything done by next Friday. Your exam will actually be on Monday, November 25th. So what I did was I took Into Thin Air off the table. I took that problem set off the table because I wanted you to focus on studying all next week and the weekend. There'll be another problem set pertaining to endocrinology after exam 3. So you'll still have 12 problem sets and you can drop 2. Remember, these are great buffer points to help you buffer any maybe exam grade. All right, any questions that you may have so far? Oops, there you go, sure. All right, so let's continue on. We will have a top hat question today. Let's see here. Okay, so we're going to start with Intro to Respiratory. Here we are. This is where we left off last time. We actually talked about the base of the respiratory system. It's going to take a minute for this to come up. And I went through the functions of the respiratory system in the last few minutes of Wednesday's lecture. So here's where we're going to start off. We're going to dive in and talk about more details associated with the upper and lower respiratory tract. Again, there's 2 main parts. The upper respiratory tract includes the mouth, nasal cavity, pharynx, and trachea. And the lower respiratory tract, which we're going to talk about in just a second, is the bronchi and lungs. Then we're going to get into what alveoli are. That's plural for alveolus. Those are the air sacs that are the site of gas exchange. And then finally, when we get into the mechanics of breathing, I'll be talking about the pleural sacs that actually surround each lung. All right, so let's start off here. This is why it's in bold at the top. Let's start off with the upper respiratory tract. This is just, again, gross anatomy to help you with this. You can see here, you can breathe through both your mouth and your nostrils here. So you can see the nostril, the nasal cavities. Actually, up in the nasal cavities, this is the opening of the auditory tube, the eustachian tube. And you can see external nose. You have some nasal cavity and sinuses up here, all part of the upper respiratory tract. This is actually the hard palate and soft palate here. And the back of your throat is considered the pharynx. So when you actually eat something, this soft palate rises up to actually protect the nasal cavity from getting, say, food in your nasal cavity, unless you're drinking milk and you happen to laugh and then it just breaks down and milk comes out your nose. But if everything is working properly, this soft palate should rise up and protect those nasal cavities when you eat. All right, so you also have the tongue here. Again, the back of your throat is the pharynx. But this is what I want you to concentrate on too. The epiglottis. This doesn't do it justice, but the epiglottis is actually an omega-shaped structure that, again, when you eat, it bends down and covers this area right here. The glottis. This whole area right here is considered the glottis. It's the supraglottis and subglottis. And it's really all within this area right here. So when you eat, this epiglottis bends down again. It folds over to protect the windpipe, the trachea, when you swallow. And then you have the larynx here, which contains the voice box, your vocal cords, and then the trachea. And the trachea is surrounded by omega-shaped cartilaginous rings that help protect that particular structure. And that's more towards the ventral side of your throat, right? And then the esophagus is closer to your spinal cord here, towards your dorsal side. So you can also see how that's organized. All right, so this is all considered the upper respiratory tract. And I'm going to go to this particular slide. This shows you that the trachea divides into the two major bronchi, the right and left bronchi. And notice that as the bronchi continue to branch into bronchioles, you can't even see some of the respiratory bronchioles on this because it just actually branches into so many structures that you wouldn't be able to plasticize it. And I'll give you an example here. Essentially, there are 8 million alveoli within each lung. So you can see there's absolutely a ton of extensive branching that occurs within the lung. And within each branch, very closely associated with each branch, is a rich blood supply. So that's what I want you to kind of take home. Looking at this particular diagram, you can see how closely associated the blood supply is, the circulatory system is, to each airway. Okay, all of the different branching that occurs. So now we've kind of mixed up both the upper and lower respiratory tract, but we'll get back on track here. So this is one of those diagrams that I tell students always to star. Okay, I always kind of give you this information up front. This is one of them that I want you to memorize. Again, it's fair game for some kind of labeling exercise on exam 3. It looks pretty, easy, but there's a lot of information here. Okay, so what this is telling you is it's giving you an idea of the major differences between the conducting zone, I mentioned this on Wednesday, and the respiratory zone. All right, so this is kind of inconspicuous. It's not, students can easily overlook this, but this is telling the whole story, right? This orange bar right here is telling you this is everything in the conducting zone, and then it continues to branch, and this is giving you the structures within the respiratory zone. So I mentioned this last time. What is the major difference between the conducting zone and the respiratory zone? The conducting zone, there's no gas exchange, right? This is considered dead space, anatomical dead space. But the respiratory zone, this is where all the gas exchange occurs, which includes the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveolar sacs. And as I mentioned before, there's about 8 million alveolar sacs per lung. All right, so also remember, I mentioned this last time too, the bronchioles are a site of dynamic regulation because they have a lot of smooth muscle that are associated with them. They have circular smooth muscles that line these airways, which determines how easily airflow can occur. And we talked about bronchodilation. If there's relaxation of that smooth muscle, it's going to open up the airways. If there's constriction, if there's contraction of that smooth muscle and constriction of those bronchioles, it's going to increase the resistance and decrease flow through that area. That's called bronchoconstriction. Now, asthma is a perfect example of issues with bronchodilation and bronchoconstriction. A lot of times bronchoconstriction occurs which reduces flow into the lung. It's interesting with asthma that it's not about getting air into the lungs. It's actually about getting air out into the lungs, out of the lungs, okay? So a good example of this is I had a former student who was a paramedic, and a lot of times he'd come upon a patient out in the field that was suffering from some kind of severe asthma attack, especially with little kids. What they would do is the kids would be gasping for air, almost gulping air because they would get scared, and they would just bring more and more air into their lungs until their lungs were actually hyperextended because they couldn't get the air out. So for little kids, they could just go up and squeeze their chest, right? Give them a big bear hug and try to force the air out to help them breathe. So again, with asthma, it's not about getting the air in, it's really about getting that air out. Some people use an inhaler, which is actually something called albuterol. You all know this also as a beta adrenergic agonist. Remember we talked about beta adrenergic receptors in the SA node. It helps to increase heart rate. This is the sympathetic response. It activates, right? This is all part of that sympathetic nervous system activation. And the same thing happens in the lungs. Albuterol activates those beta adrenergic receptors, which help open up the lungs, helps with bronchodilation to help with flow. Okay, so let's take a look at the structures here. That's important. The conducting zone is made up of the trachea. This column right here is giving you some information about the numbers of tubes in each branch. Trachea, we only have one tube. It splits into the major right and left bronchi, so there's two. It continues to branch. You have a number of bronchi and then bronchioles, right? 16 bronchioles and then a number of terminal bronchioles. Remember, this is where there's no gas exchange. This is all about just bulk airflow. Now, we can change the conducting zone. Think about this. If I put a snorkel in my mouth, I actually increase the dead space. I increase that conducting zone. So if you are someone that's anesthesiologist and you're in the operating room and you tube somebody, you have to factor in that dead zone when you're actually making those calculations to give someone some anesthesia. And you have to calculate that in when you're actually dialing in their respiratory rate. So interesting. That's all part of the dead space, part of the conducting zone. The respiratory zone, again, this is where the gas exchange occurs. That includes the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, so there's about 50,000 respiratory bronchioles, and then 8 million alveolar sacs. All right, so keeping with the upper respiratory tract and the conducting zone, what are some of the functions of the conducting zone? It provides low resistance pathway. It's a low resistance pathway for airflow. So resistance is physiologically regulated by changes in contraction of airway smooth muscle and by physical forces acting upon the airways. It also defends against microbes, toxic chemicals, and other foreign matter. Like I'm going to talk just a minute here about mucociliary clearance. And here's where I give my anti-smoking campaign here. Cilia are actually little appendages that are on the apical membrane of epithelial cells within the lungs. And the cilia, it also secretes some mucus, but the cilia beat back and forth. So it captures a lot of foreign particles, bacteria, a lot of times viruses. And again, remember, these epithelial cells are the barrier between the outside world and the inside of your body. So what usually happens is that mucus and the cilia, they capture some of these foreign materials, and it beats back and forth, so it allows for that mucus to actually travel up towards your upper respiratory tract so that you can cough out that mucus and get rid of those foreign material. This is something called mucociliary clearance. Okay, mucociliary clearance. When you smoke, if you're a smoker, what happens is you freeze those cilia, right? You freeze them. It compromises mucociliary clearance, and then you're more susceptible to bacteria and viral infections. Okay, so know that. Again, that upper respiratory tract and the conducting zone help defend against microbes, toxic chemicals, and other foreign matter. It also warms and moistens the air. That's kind of interesting as well. When the volume of air that you breathe in, especially in the wintertime, is actually less than the volume of air that you breathe out, right? Because the volume of air that you breathe in is cold and doesn't have a lot of moisture to it, it's going to be smaller than the volume of air that you actually breathe out, okay? So the function of the conducting zone is also to warm and moisten the air, and then we also talked about this as well. Phonation is the production of sound, right? You phonate, you're using your vocal cords to produce sound. So all these are functions of the conducting zone. All right, now the lower respiratory tract, it includes those bronchioles and lungs. We're going to talk about what alveoli are. You can actually see, remember, alveoli are where most of the gas exchange occurs. And take a look at this. You actually have the wall of the air sac here. I'm looking at the top right-hand corner of this diagram here. It's giving you some information about the anatomy of the alveoli. You can see air actually enters and exits through the same opening. And oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. Oxygen is brought into the capillary beds. It diffuses into the capillaries, and carbon dioxide diffuses out. Okay, but remember, you have 8 million alveoli sacs, and each one of them actually has a capillary bed that's closely associated with it. Think about that. That is some pretty extensive branching of the pulmonary capillaries. So, very interesting. You can actually see also within the alveolar sacs, you have different cell types. So notice the cell type number 1 and number 2, and today we're actually going to focus on type 2. These are called alveolar type 2 cells, and they secrete something called surfactant. We're going to get to that in just a minute. Surfactant is phospholipids and proteins that actually help to keep these alveolar sacs open. Okay. All right, so again, the lower respiratory tract includes the lungs and the bronchioles, including the alveolar sacs. We're going to go to this one too. There's a cluster of alveoli. Now, I kind of have a beef with this diagram. Basically, it's thought now that the alveolar sacs aren't actually depicted as a cluster of grapes anymore. You can kind of see it looks like a cluster of grapes. They're actually a more diagrammed now as something that looks like this, right? They're not quite the grape-like structures that you think about. This is probably a more appropriate diagram for the alveolar sacs. Okay, so just so you know. But I do want to impress upon you all of the capillary beds that surround each of those alveolar sacs. That's a pretty important part of this as well. So in close proximity of those alveolar sacs are the pulmonary blood circulation that allows for very efficient and thorough gas exchange between air and blood. All right, so let's focus now on the alveoli, right? Alveoli are plural for alveolus, and again, they are the site of gas exchange. So taking a look at this, you can actually see the terminal bronchioles are still part of the conducting zone. Here are the respiratory bronchioles. This actually is the start of the respiratory zone. The alveolar ducts and the alveolar sacs. So this is a very nice scanning electron micrograph that gives you, a more realistic view of the duct. That's the D here. I'll blow this up for you. Here's the finest airways in the lung. And here's the duct portion, D. And then A is standing for, that's symbolizing the alveolar sacs. So extensive branching of the alveoli produces lots of surface area for exchange of air and blood. And the capillary walls, the alveolar walls and the capillary walls are very thin, so it really helps to promote rapid diffusion. Okay, so this is an interesting part of the respiratory tract that's very different than bird lungs. This is more representative of mammalian lungs. So this is a comparative physiology example. In humans, we are negative pressure breathers. Negative pressure breathers. So when we breathe, our rib cages expand, which produces a negative pressure within our lungs, pulling air in. That's different from like frogs, which swallow their air. They actually gulp their air and force it. Positive pressure, forcing the air into their lungs. Okay? So you can actually see here, air that's brought into our lungs travels down the conducting zone. This is just about bulk airflow, into the respiratory zone, and then fresh air mixes with stale air from the last breath. All right? So there's a dilution effect. Again, the fresh air is actually mixing with some of the stale air left over from the previous breath. So it's somewhat inefficient if you think about it. Bird lungs are a little bit different. Let me show you. I think this is an interesting video showing you how much more efficient bird lungs are. So let's see here. Here's airflow in the birds. This is actually narrated. Let's see here. All right.
The unique respiratory system of birds includes air sacs in addition to lungs. The lungs, but not the air sacs, function in gas exchange. The functions of the air sacs is to allow air to flow unidirectionally through the bird's respiratory system. Here we show a full cycle of airflow, which requires 2 breaths.
That's the first breath. And then the second breath brings it in.
To see this more diagrammatically, we group the many air sacs of the respiratory system into 2 main types, posterior and anterior air sacs. During an inhalation, the air sacs expand. Air from the environment is drawn into the posterior air sacs, while the air in the lungs is drawn into the anterior air sacs. During an exhalation, the air sacs compress, pushing air from the posterior air sacs into the lungs, and the air in the anterior air sacs out through the trachea. After a second full breath, air in the respiratory system completes the cycle. It leaves the lungs, passes through the anterior air sacs, and finally exits the body.
Okay, so the significance of this is that because birds have both these posterior and anterior air sacs, it ensures that fresh air always enters into the lungs. It's never mixing with stale air, which I think is fascinating, right? Where we have trouble actually going up to Mount Everest when there's thin air, right? Birds can easily fly at high altitude because their lungs are so efficient, which I think is amazing. So I just wanted to make sure that you all had that information. I think this is pretty much the end of the video. All right. So I will post this. This video actually isn't on your website.
The unique respiratory system of birds includes air sacs in addition.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we're negative pressure breathers, and basically when we breathe in fresh air, it mixes with stale air. All right, so let's talk about surfactants. Now, I'm going to go back and just show you again those alveolar type 2 cells. You can actually see this here. If you're looking at the anatomy of an alveolar sac, you actually see type 1 and type 2 cells. And it's these type 2 cells that are secreting surfactant. Okay, secreting surfactant. And let's focus on that for a minute. Surfactant is a combination of phospholipids and proteins. And the way I think about it is it's kind of like a detergent almost. It's in its makeup. So you know how when you were a little kid you could dip a wand into bubbles and blow bubbles, right? That's how I think about it. It's like those bubbles. The nature of this particular molecule kind of opens up, it increases the stretchability of the alveoli, which allows it to stay open. All right? So technically what it does, it reduces surface tension by intercalating. It actually kind of gets in between water molecules right at the air-liquid interface. So it reduces that surface tension by disrupting the cohesive forces between water molecules. It kind of forces itself in between the water molecules right at the air-liquid interface. So if you've ever looked at a water column, like in a flask, right, and you can see the meniscus, where the air and liquid interface with each other, that's where you're going to see this little meniscus where all the surface tension is. So again, surfactants reduce that surface tension. And the result is an increase in lung compliance. Another word for lung compliance is the stretchability of the alveoli, and a decrease in the force that's needed to inflate the lungs. Okay, so I'm going to introduce compliance and what that means, but we're going to revisit this when on Monday. So compliance is a technical term that's giving you the relationship between volume, change in volume, and change in pressure. It's the change in volume over the change in pressure. So if green is normal compliance, the orange is basically reduced compliance. And what this is actually saying is that it takes more pressure, more of a pressure change to open up the alveoli. And when you do open up the alveoli, you really don't get much change in volume. So it's really difficult to open up alveoli. This would be an example of decreased compliance. The blue line, on the other hand, right, is that you don't really have to use a lot of pressure. The pressure gradient doesn't have to be that large in order to make huge changes in volume. So it's very easy to open up the alveoli. That would be increased compliance. So again, thinking about it, lung compliance is a measure of stretchability. So that's what compliance means. All right. So here is a really nice summary slide of surfactant. It's a mixture of phospholipids and protein. It's secreted by the type 2 alveolar cells. It lowers the surface tension at the alveolar surface and increases the stretchability of the alveoli. Lung compliance. Makes the lungs easier to expand. Now, here's where it gets a little bit more difficult. Its surface tension is lower in smaller alveoli, stabilizing the alveoli. So let's take a look at this. Gets a little bit more complicated here. This is actually called the law of Laplace. Law of Laplace. I'm going to switch over the document camera. Make sure everybody has that term down. Law, oops. All right. The law of Laplace. I think it's French again. I probably butchered the name, as always. There's a lot of French terms in physiology, in foundational general physiology. Law of Laplace. All right, so going back, that's what this is about. This is the law of Laplace at the top. P, now I'm not going to say this is the hydrostatic pressure. We talked about hydrostatic pressure before. This is airways, so this is going to be aerostatic pressure is equal to 2 times T is surface tension. Surface tension divided by the radius of the alveoli. Okay, so what this is saying is if surface tension is high, then the aerostatic pressure is going to be high. Or if the radius is, let's just say, small, like B here, then the aerostatic pressure is actually going to be high. There's an inverse relation. So the smaller the radius, the higher the aerostatic pressure. Okay? So usually, if no surfactant is on board, you're not secreting surfactant, you have different sizes of alveoli. What's going to happen, because surface tension is equal, right? The surface tension in A is exactly the same as the surface tension in B, because there's no surfactant. Then because of the differences in the radius, the pressure in A is actually going to be less than the pressure in B. And air is always going to flow from high pressure to low pressure. We know that through Ohm's law. Air is always going to flow from high pressure to low pressure. And what you're going to see is alveolar collapse. It's actually going to collapse some of the alveoli. Now, if surfactant is being secreted, then because of its unique properties, it's going to lower the surface tension, particularly in the smaller alveoli. Okay? So, if it lowers the surface tension in the smaller alveoli, then it's going to equalize the pressure and you're going to prevent alveolar collapse. That's the beauty of surfactant. Okay, that's the beauty of surfactant. And it all has to do with the law of Laplace. Okay, so what else does surfactant do? Even when we're sleeping, when we're laying in a horizontal position overnight, we do have some alveolar collapse. So it's always a good idea, I actually do this, when you wake up in the morning and you stand up, take a deep breath, because stretch of those alveolar type 2 cells actually secretes surfactant to help open up those airways and keep them open, right? It's a good idea to do that. A deep breath increases its secretion, okay? And concentration actually decreases when the breaths are small. A lot of times after someone has surgery, there's such significant amount of alveolar collapse, they give them something called an incentive spirometer, right? It gets them to breathe in deeply so that they can secrete surfactant and open up those airways. An incentive spirometer. All right, so I'm going to make a connection for you here too. This is interesting. You probably know that a lot of times preemies, babies that are born too early, before 24 weeks, they have lung issues. Why do they have lung issues? Because babies don't produce surfactant until late gestation. All right, so that's the major thing. I had a former student, probably about 10 years ago, who had triplets. Triplets. And she said that they were born early. They gave the babies a shot of synthetic surfactant to help with their development because they were born early. So, interesting stuff. That's the end of this lecture. Let's go ahead and do our top. All right, top hat question. Get your top hat. We just have one today. Open this up. All right. Okay, also while we're waiting for this, I am going to have a review session next Friday afternoon. And it will be between 3 and 5. 3 and 5, I'm going to try to get B45. So we'll have a nice review session. All right. Oops, that's not it. This is it right here. All right. So here's our question for today. Surfactants, it's kind of lengthy. A, decrease surface tension, especially in smaller alveoli, and effectively increase lung compliance? Or does it increase surface tension and decrease lung compliance? Or C, does it decrease surface tension and decrease compliance? Or D, does it increase both? So, what do you think? What do surfactants do? All right, we're up to about 65 students. There we go. Give you about 10 more seconds. All right. Let's go ahead and close this one. And the correct answer is A. Nice job. Sweet. 88% of you all got that right. So good job this morning. It does decrease surface tension and increase lung compliance. We're going to revisit lung compliance on Monday and talk about the differences between cystic fibrosis and emphysema. Cystic fibrosis is an example of low lung compliance, where emphysema is actually an increase in lung compliance. All right, so let's keep going. The next presentation here, here we go, is mechanics of breathing. As I said before, I wish that we could just talk about breathing in and breathing out and we'd be done with it, but it's a little bit more complicated than that.